he'll start off and give us how he got involved in this project, what was involved in it, and what were some of the, what he learned from it. So turn it over to Vincent.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here. Nice to see everybody. I first learned about the Hizmet movement before that term was used commonly by going to some of the events through the invitation of a colleague. And the more I learned, the more I wanted to know. And especially when I learned about the Hizmet schools, my curiosity was really piqued. I'm a college professor in the field of sociology, and my field is race and ethnic relations. That's what most of my research is in. I've also served as an educational consultant to quite a few school systems over the years. So the marrying of those two interests and experience was what helped me get interested in this particular movement. So a friend of mine, a colleague at my department, Mahmoud Ansari, and I began talking about this. Mahmoud attended a conference in which there were several papers given about some of the schools. And when he came back from that conference, we began to talk some more. And as sociologists, we were very much interested in, from our perspective, what the culture had to do with the school's success. In other words, there is an educational model, the Hizmet schools, and as each businessman has sponsored these schools and each administrator has established it somewhere, there's a framework, a structure, a model that is used. But my wondering was, if you set up a school such as that in another country, how does its culture, its history, its demographics impact upon the mission of the school to succeed? And the only way that would make sense is if I did a cross-cultural comparison of many different places. And that was the framework in which we began to just see what we could find out. We were very much inspired by the mission, and we wanted to see how it worked in all different places. That's how we began.
Okay. As you began, I think, of course, the Hizmet program in Turkey was very powerful already from back in the earlier period of time, but it got closed down.
Right.
One question I had was, did that affect the schools that you visited, the experience that was going on and the how they were being persecuted, the Hizmet people in Turkey? Did that affect your own experience at all?
No, it did not. It did later in the writing of the book, but if I could just backtrack us a little bit. When we began our research, it was in the year 2012. All was well, still at this point in time. And as I said, the term Hizmet was not yet used. What we decided to do was first visit a couple of Muslim majority countries. We deliberately chose Bosnia as a starting point, partly because it is a Muslim majority, but it is also a multicultural, multi-religious country that had suffered terribly with great violence back in the 1990s with the so-called ethnic cleansing and extermination of far, far too many people. The violence there, people simply suffering because of who they were in their religion, sadly similar to what's going on in the Ukraine these days. We picked Bosnia. We also picked Albania. The second year, we went to another Muslim majority country, and that was Kazakhstan, very different from the other two, both in their cultures, their histories, and so on. In the third year, we went to two Muslim minority countries, Christian countries, Romania and Poland. And in the final year of our studies, where we went was to countries that are Christian in terms of the demographics in the majority, but actually secular and multicultural. And I'm talking about the United States and Canada. So that's where we went. But if I may, I think it's very important to talk about how we did this. What we have in this book is the voices. We have the voices here of over 300 people, students from the 5th grade up through postgraduate, post doctoral. We interviewed dozens upon dozens of teachers at all of the levels. We interviewed parents in all of these countries. We also interviewed administrators as well as businessmen who were the financial supporters. All of these people were the ones we interviewed. We went to schools that were co-ed, that were sex segregated, that were commuters only, and were also boarding schools only, or a mixture. We did all of that we could do. But I think the most important thing that would be helpful in understanding what's in the book is what we mean by an interview. As sociologists, we are trained on interview techniques and the approach you take. You can't ask questions that already suggest the answer, leading question. You have to make your subjects who are being interviewed feel comfortable in speaking to you. Most importantly, you have to be sure they're not simply saying what they think you want to hear. And so we have to do various kinds of questionings and follow-ups and that sort of thing. We follow certain very restrictive guidelines for academic research in terms of assuring that everyone will remain anonymous, that everything is strictly confidential. We were the ones who picked who we interviewed. So it wasn't a setup of programmed people coming in to see us to say what was said. We had to assure administrators of the purity of our intentions, that we were not there to rake them, to evaluate them, to talk about their school and tell somebody else about the school. So we were very careful using what is known as the scientific method in order to get the best possible answers. And so through these 4 years of interviewing, before all the troubles began, we got very honest answers from people that we were comfortable with. And after the fact, I was about to write the book when we had what happened with Mr. Erdogan deciding to purge people of good intentions. And he pressured people, schools were shut down, people I had met and known were imprisoned, changes happened. And so what I held back writing the book deliberately for a couple of years because I had a lot of names in the book. And I was hoping this would pass, something would change. And I didn't want to harm anybody, so I waited. It became obvious that was not happening. And before my data became too obsolete, I had captured a moment. I had captured a slice of life over 4 years of what these schools can do, would do, and had done. And I wanted that story to be told. And so the more Mahmoud and I interviewed all these people, the more impressed we became by what we had discovered. And it emerged as more and more of a positive learning experience for us. And so that's why, before I say anything else, I just wanted, a little of my background, a little of the motivation, and a little bit of how we went about things for the reliability, the validity, the objectivity of what we had to say.
So now it's 2022, and a lot of things have happened. Do you think that the results of your study stand for themselves? In other words, do you have any new thoughts about what you like, for example, I think some of the areas of the world have changed as time has gone on. Do you think that the results are still pretty much the same as far as what you came up with even now in 2022?
I guess I'm going to start to answer your question by saying there's a term we use in many different capacities. It's called universal. We talk about universal truths. We talk about universal human values. There are certainties in life, no matter where you look in life or what is happening. Yes, there's been changes, but the schools exist throughout the world. There's over 1,000 of these schools in 140 different countries. I used to say there were over 1,400 schools. I cannot say that anymore. But while there is a serious impact in certain countries, obviously Turkey, Romania, and other places, and where we do not see the blossoming of young people through these schools that we once did. They still work in many other parts of the world. They're still relevant. They are still achieving what they set out to do. And so when I wrote this book, I wanted to reach two audiences. I will tell about the first now. I will tell about the second later. I thought it was a story that needed to be told. And I wanted to inform and I wanted to enlighten people who knew nothing about Hizmet, people who may have been influenced by some of the critics and the government actions in Turkey, or just didn't know, didn't care, were indifferent. I just wanted this story to be told to that audience. That's one of the purposes of writing the book. I also would speak to the title, Hearts and Minds. It's an expression that has been used in many times with the Vietnam War and elsewhere. But it first was used in my presence by a 15-year-old boy. I believe he was in Poland. And he was talking about how much he liked this school and how much he liked this teacher and the education he got. And he said, I have learned a lot. And that is very good up here. And he pointed to his head. He said, but it's also important what you learn here. And I have learned more than I ever thought I could learn here. I would later hear other students use the term hearts and minds as well. So the cover is the hot air balloon. Symbolism here, the shape of a heart. It's drifting across a landscape that has no borders. And the concept I was trying to convey with the cover was the fact that this altruistic motivation for the common good, drifting across irrespective of what is below in terms of who's saying what. And it's just the idea of an idea spreading across the land, hence the book.
You know, some people have compared the Hizmet schools to the Jesuit educational program. But one big difference is you mentioned the word universal values. I think it's interesting that reading your book and from my own experience, the Hizmet schools do not teach religious doctrine at all. It's universal human values. Could you pick up on that and how that approach is a very comprehensive approach for ethical values, but it doesn't impose any particular religion on the students?
Yes, and actually I do mention the comparison to the Jesuits in the book at one point. What you have is the underpinnings of these schools are the teachings of Mr. Gulam and his wanting to prepare a golden generation, a new generation that will work toward the common good. The promotion, there's so many things involved in this, but the underpinnings growing out of Islam are these universal human values, ethics, universal ethics. Religion is definitely not taught in these schools. In the upper grades, there's a comparative religion course, but all upper institutions teach that kind of course anyway.
Right.
But no, religion is not taught. As a matter of fact, there had been all kinds of claims and criticisms of the schools having a secret religious agenda or even having a secret political agenda. Those were two of the attacks that were being made on these schools. We decided to look into that too. So as we are looking into many things, we were asking very quiet and very subtle questions of our students in different ways to see if there was any truth to those criticisms and attacks. And I can tell you that at least in all the schools we went to in these 7 different countries on 3 continents, that was not the case. There was no secret agenda. There was an agenda, but that wasn't it. So maybe I should talk about the agenda and some of our findings.
Sure.
I think the best thing I learned, well, let me first talk about the 2 main missions. You'll find in any mission statement for the schools, they have twin goals. The first goal is to provide as high a quality education as possibly can be done, especially in the STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, math. Uh, that's the structure of the schools. They were all excellent facilities, state-of-the-art equipment. And the structure of the curriculum was such that this was indeed achieved. The schools produced excellent graduates going to some of the finest schools, moving into the civic bureaucracy and so forth. The second goal was the one that intrigued me especially, which was this desire not only to promote interfaith dialogue, but actively to encourage it, not by lecturing. I had so many teachers tell me about their dedication. And these teachers were of all ages, of all nationalities, not just Muslim teachers either. I interviewed teachers who were single moms, teachers who were married, teachers who were older, teachers younger, men all over. And there's no such thing as a perfect school. There's no such thing as every teacher is perfect. We've all had bad teachers. I imagine you can name a few. I know I can. So it wasn't a perfect place. There were some teachers that some of the students complained about. I don't know whether that was teenage griping institutional or the grade or the harshness or whatever. But by and large, we found an incredible cadre of highly dedicated teachers giving up their time, extra time, not just to educate the mind, but the heart as well. I had so many teachers say, I do this by example. I do this with them. They educate the whole person, not just the person in that classroom with that subject matter. I saw through all these interviews, the bond between teacher and student so strong, like none I have ever witnessed in any other capacity, in any other country, in any other school system. It was really impressive. But the most impressive thing for me, the thing that struck down one of the negative stereotypes of the Muslim people, was the fact that so many of these young women, ages 13, 14, 15 in particular, I'm speaking about now, talked about how these schools changed them, gave them a higher self-esteem, gave them greater self-confidence to be a full person as they wish to be. Boys and girls in these schools, in the middle schools and in the upper grades and high schools, were treated equally, encouraged to participate. There was no sexism, no subordination, no second-class citizenship. It was a beautiful thing to see and hear. Students raved not just about their teachers, not just about their sense of becoming a greater person, but they also spoke about being more open-minded, bragging, in fact, about they now had friends of a different religion. There was also a real problem in our schools in every country, including the United States, of bullying. Parents would speak to us about they felt the schools were safe, and in some of those countries they were not, the public schools, that is. Gangs or bullying or whatever. I had one young man, he was a smaller frame, he was 14 years old, and he was very small, and he was a Christian. And in his first year in the Hizmet school as a freshman, he was beat up, he was bullied. He spoke about it. By the end of the year, some of those people who were beating him up, he said, are now my best friends. And how did that happen? This is part of this educating the whole person and the heart and the attitude. And the teachers would talk about this. One of the students said, my teachers are really cool. They know how to do conflict management and tame us down. And they would speak to that element of it. In some countries, the Turkish custom of tea time, especially in the Balkans, in Albania, and in Bosnia, and Kazakhstan as well. Tea time after the classes. Teacher would gather together with students in informal sessions and talk about it. There was no structure, no agenda. It was just you talked. how to be a good person, how to be a better person, how to develop empathy for the other, or to ask the teacher questions you wouldn't even, or even afraid to ask your parents. There's so many ways we could talk about this,
Yeah.
but I'll stop there because I'm running on.
Let me ask another kind of question. One thing that came to mind as I was looking at your book, reading your book, we know that these schools mainly are part of the middle class life for most of the people. They're up and coming in their cultures, and the parents want, very high level of education. And the Hizmet movement has often been called a kind of a Protestant, an Islamic form of Calvinism. In other words, you're moving ahead in society. The question I have is, I guess, are these schools able to reach out into the lower classes? Because the split in Islam between certain people who are in the middle class, let's say, with a Western style education, versus those who are who don't have that kind of education. There's a divide kind of between both in Christianity and Islam. You look at our own country between educated people and those who say just have high school education.
Right.
So I guess the question is this a slice of culture of the upper middle class, or is it reached down into the lower classes as well?
Very good question.
Yeah.
Very good question. I guess I'll start by saying, without question, these schools are elitist.
That's my question.
But I'm going to define elitist. The students and parents are mostly middle class, to be sure. They are mostly middle class, most particularly here in the United States and in Canada. Not necessarily that way back in the other countries I was in, but they are mostly middle class students. However, what I mean by elitist is this. There is great demand to have your child in these schools. They have an incredibly strong reputation for the quality of their education, but also for this learning environment that I was speaking about before. What is done in each country is entrance exams are given for these students to attend. And I spoke to many of the administrators about this. They do publicize widely, not just on social media, but they actually send representatives to the far-flung areas of the country to have students take the test. I learned of how elitist it was in some of the schools where somewhere between 1,000 to 1,500 people would be taking the test to get into a class of 50. That's a pretty narrowing of the funnel, isn't it? And who's getting in? Those with the highest grades. So the elitist element is these are the most intellectually able students who are coming in. I had administrators talk to me about pressures they received from politicians and diplomats to get their children in. They wanted them in, and they had to resist this because once you start that, where do you stop? And their way of turning it down was speaking to the strictness of the scores. Right. So you do get in the best students. However, that might not necessarily mean you're middle class. Right. And so there is, through the generosity of many financial supporters, scholarships that are offered to these students. And the scholarships are partly based on achievement, but they're also partly based on need. In most of these countries, the teachers visit each family at least once a year. And if the family lives about 2 or 3 hours away, they go with their families there for the day's visit. And part of it is this bonding between parent, teacher, and school, the triad. But it's also to size up the family. How many other children are there in the family? What is their income? Could they benefit from a better scholarship as long as they're achieving? So through financial aid, there is some reaching out to it. But I did interview parents of all extremes. I interviewed a Supreme Court judge. I mean, that's pretty high up there. But I also interviewed a good number of working class people, parents operating a mom and pop store, just that sort of thing. My favorite story, I'm running along here, I apologize, but my favorite story is a Bosnian Christian man. He was clearly working class, TV cameraman, and yet he was a financial supporter for the school. Mm-hmm. And I asked him, as I did many of the other businessmen, why? It's a struggle for you. Why are you giving a generous portion to the school? And he had a 15-year-old girl in the high school there. And he was a Christian. He had lived through the ethnic cleansing of the 90s. And he said to me, when I was younger, we all got along. We didn't even know who each other was, what they were. It didn't matter. We were just friends or neighbors or whatever. It didn't matter. As many of you may know, Sarajevo used to be called the Jerusalem of Europe because it has so many faiths all together. In fact, literally, there's one corner that has a synagogue, a mosque, and a church all in that one area. He said it was once so wonderful, and then the horror happened. He said, my daughter came home. The school had exposed her to feelings I had forgotten. Feelings I missed. Feelings I would like to have again. And if a school can do that and make my child feel that way, I want to support that school. And so another little story, but it's a working class story.
I was at Mr. Gouland's retreat center in Pennsylvania a few years ago. And I met some of the teachers from Eastern Europe that were visiting there. And I was amazed. They were saying they were visiting the graduates of the Gouland schools in some of the places you visited here in the United States that had gotten into major US universities. So I thought that was another interesting thing of how this is like a community that's created in the schools, which continues on even after you graduate. So I don't know if that kind of every school likes to have a community of support. Did you find that's true, that the graduates do create kind of a community and they connect with the overall movement?
Very, very much so. Time and again, there were times I was at schools and it was alumni from 4 or 5 years ago coming back to visit, and I'd grab them and I would interview them. There's so much in that regard. I talked to alumni who talked about how very much they feel such a different person because of the schools. And I had so many young people, some of them in teacher preparatory college courses and so forth, talking about how wonderful an experience they had as a student in the school, and they wanted to pay back. They wanted to be a party, to have others have the experience that they had in the learning experience that they did. And in the book, I make a comparison to baseball, how all our baseball teams have farm teams, AAA, AA, and so forth, and people work up through the system and eventually come up to the majors. And the Hizmet schools have their own farm system. They really do. There is an encouragement, and this is part of what Mr. Gouland was talking about anyway, about developing a golden generation of people who they go out into all walks of life. There's no question about it. We found the graduates in going not just into business, as well as, of course, the teaching I'm speaking about now, but into government and in all kinds of endeavor of one kind and another, populating the world with their own visions and thoughts.
One question I had too, is in your book, you mentioned often the schools are called Turkish schools. Most of the leading administrators are Turkish. Do you think as this movement continues, it will expand the elite structure of the schools to include people from other cultures, from other backgrounds? Because it looks like right now it's primarily a Turkish culture, at least the leading figures are pretty much all Turkish. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, mostly, yes. It's quite correct. I think, first of all, the answer to your question is yes, in terms of the expansion. It already has. I mean, we mentioned before, 140 different countries. It's quite incredible there. But what you basically have as a starting point, it's clearly Turkish.
Right.
It's Turkish businessmen supporting, helping it get started. It's Turkish educators, maybe teachers themselves have experience in some other area, how become the new administrators to develop it. So yes, you do have the administrators are Turkish. In the beginning, most of these schools were mostly Turkish educators. but before long, they expand to the natives. Many of the teachers are not in the Hizmet movement, but they are part of the school program and its philosophy and its methodology. It basically expands. I think one of the successes of these schools is that they don't have a cookie cutter model that just gets planted down into the next country. They take into full consideration the culture and the history of the people. And so what you find is the Turkish culture, the language may be taught. It's taught as a, an option. You don't have to take it if you don't want to, but courses are taught in the native language, both as the language, as the history as well. In Kazakhstan, especially, the people there, the parents were extremely pleased with that kind of thing going on. And the other thing that was very good was nobody felt the pressure. The learning is in such a positive way. Muslim students did not feel any kind of pressure in a Christian majority country like Poland or Romania. Christian students in some of those Muslim majority countries also did not feel in any way pressured either to conform to the prayers or whatever. That was not a part of the learning experience.
Another question I had was, we know that some parts of the world are very authoritarian, don't seem to fit the model of Mr. Glenn is very oriented to a more democratic way of thinking. Are these schools able to impact any of these authoritarian countries? Like, I don't know if we're in Afghanistan, for example. I just was in a group with women from Afghanistan. Our organization is working with a group of female educated environmentalists in Kabul. And I don't know if that came up, if there are any Gulen schools, for example, in that country, which would be very authoritarian now, whether it can coexist with an authoritarian regime or not.
Well,
You may not know the answer.
I don't, for the most part, I don't.
Yeah.
And I'll freely admit that. But I can say this, that in every country, these schools are fully accredited by that country's government and Department of Education. So they do meet all the qualification standards that the country has set. None of these schools are attempting to challenge the status quo. The emphasis is, as I said before, on that education and also on that interaction, very positive interaction. And there are many ways in which the students at these schools engage in civic activities and charity and fundraising and so forth in these various places. So there's no direct challenge to it at all. Now, is there an enlightenment going on among students as they become adults that maybe this is not the best form of government we have or whatever? That's a possibility, I would imagine, but it's not my understanding, and what I gleaned from all of these interviews was no political agenda so that the governments do not feel challenged. As a matter of fact, I saw many pictures of some of these autocratic leaders at these schools posing either, when it was the Olympics, the academic Olympics being held or some other thing. So I think there is a kind of an even-handed kind of interaction going on.
Well, I went to Bangladesh and visited a Golan school and coexisted there with fairly conservative. So I know it does in some countries, these schools do coexist with quite conservative governments.
Yes, yeah.
Maybe not as conservative as or as oppressive as Turkey, which has now closed the schools completely.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure about Afghanistan if they've ever gotten in there, but certainly they need to be there if they're not there now.
But also the fact of the matter is these schools cost the government nothing.
Right.
All right. So there's no expense to them. And it is preparing its own citizens.
Yeah.
So I think there is a realization that this is a good thing for them too.
Yeah, I know in Kenya, which I know very well because I've been there many times, the schools are very successful and the government seems to be very appreciative of their contribution. There was an attempt to try to close the schools at one point, but it didn't work because the government and the people said, we want these schools in our country, and it got blocked. So yeah, I'm just confirming what you're saying.
Yeah.
They're usually very highly prized because the parents want them in these countries.
Most governments try to stay in power either through outright suppression or by co-opting and cooling out the people who have any kind of power or energy or, wherewithal to do something. You can do that by repression. You can do that by encouraging people to leave, or you can do that by allowing certain kinds of conditions to exist that will satisfy people getting their children educated in a very strong way.
Right.
I-
Well, maybe 5 more minutes and
Right.
then we'll have a Q&A.
Then let me slip in one last thing quick before I run out of time. I said there were 2 reasons I wrote the book. The first, again, was to enlighten people who know nothing about this movement and to understand and be more accurately informed of what's there. But my second target audience in writing the book was people like you. Some of you here are educators yourselves, or supporters of these schools, or have been involved in the schools, or at the very least are part of a movement that is understanding what these schools are all about. In some way, each of you is connected to these schools as being part of the movement. If you are an educator, from time to time, I'm sure somebody has really thanked you, either a parent or the student, for the job you've done. We educators kind of live on that a little bit, and you always hope that's the tip of the iceberg, that there's more people out there like that. Anyone who is involved in this movement, in these schools, you do so with a dedication, you do so with the belief that you're doing something really, really fine. You may not express it that way, but it's with the satisfaction of not only educating young people, but preparing them to be better people. And you give up your time, you give up your energy to make that happen. And you have some feedback. This book is kind of for you. It's kind of as a broad-based, cross-cultural, multi-continent study upon hundreds of people giving honest comments. Their voices are in this book. It is a thank you to each of you. It is a pat on the shoulder. It is a thank you. I gave a talk just last night, and a young man came up to me, he and his wife from Kazakhstan. And he said, "You brought tears to my eyes when you reminded me of what I had as a student when I was in Kazakhstan at one of the schools." That's what this book is about, folks. It's to tell you what you think you're doing, you are doing. And it is a wonderful tribute. And I hope it just in some way inspires you even further to keep up the good work you're doing.
We'll open it to questions now, or any comments you might have.
Please. I'm not scared.
Yeah, too emotional to ask anything at this moment. Give us a few minutes after your remarks.
Okay, first of all, I read your book. And I was taking some notes. I was actually asked to produce a summary for the community as well. So I really enjoyed reading it. And one of the things that struck me was while I was reading the book, I was thinking about whether there could be something called the Gulen educational model. And I was asking myself, well, there's something that's going on and it's working in different countries. Some is really highly Christian, some is, highly Muslim. And then there are some common themes, there's some philosophy, there's some methodology behind all these schools. I was wondering if this movement could produce something like an educational model that could be possibly utilized by the world, maybe not just by the movement itself, but maybe for a wider audience. I know you have the background in sociology, maybe this is educational, and I'm kind of engineer background, so this is not my area, but could there be such a thing? Could there be utilized maybe like within the United States where there are a lot of problems in public schools, for example?
Mhm.
And given the context that there's like a charter school associated a lot of charter with the GLAM movement, but I have not heard anything in the movement regarding to such a model or some thoughts of such a model, but that was the thing that came to mind.
All right, thank you for your comments. For those of you perhaps out of earshot or on Zoom, the question basically is asking, could what I've been talking about and what the movement has serve as a model for elsewhere? Is there such a model? And so I would start by saying, I think very definitely this is an educational model. The book tries to talk about its structure, its mission, and its process, but I do say there is something called the Gulen, if you wish, or don't even use Mr. Gulen's name. There is clearly here an educational model. The purpose of the book, again, I want other people to know about it who aren't part of it. So I would hope we could spread it. I would hope that there could be ways in which presentations made at various educational conferences. I have been an educational consultant, so I do know a little bit about this. I would hope that through, I've given one presentation on some of these findings in Philadelphia. Hopefully I and others and my colleague Mahmoud will continue to spread the word through publication, through this book being read by more people, perhaps, for people to say, we should try this. There is so much good we found in this model that works. There's some bugs, some flaws always, but it works. So thank you. I hope it does. Someone else.
I only have 10 questions.
He only has 10 questions, folks, so.
Well, not really, but I just wanted to know. You began by saying that you visited Muslim majority countries. But they're all in Europe. What happened to Indonesia? What happened to Malaysia?
All right. I'm being spanked here for not going to some other countries like Tunisia and so on.
Indonesia.
And okay, I guess the way to answer your question was, is twofold. One, we only had so much time.
Okay.
Two, we didn't have any grants. We're not, getting big money here to travel around and do an academic tour. So what we had to do was we had to depend on the goodness and hospitality of some people to allow us to be there, to help us get settled and move about on ground transportation and so forth. So what we wanted to do, I was more interested. Yes, there's so many schools, 140 countries. I could just spend a lifetime career doing only this. But I think basically what we wanted was the culture. And yes, there are different cultures in other parts of the world too. But because these schools were seen as religious schools, which they're not, they don't teach religion. We wanted to look at the different demographics. So we did have the one school in Asia, Central Asia with Kazakhstan. We did, of course, have North America with Canada and the US.
The reason I mentioned these two countries, by the way, Indonesia and Malaysia, they tend to be very stable nations. Why is that? Very democratic. Malaysia and Indonesia, they have many ethnicities. Sunnis, Shiite, Hindus, you name it. And every group has a voice in the parliament. In fact, in Malaysia, the president can rotate between Sunni or Shia. So they have religion, but they also have stability because they have democracy.
Mhm.
That's the point.
No, it's a point well taken. I accept it.
Question number 2. Okay. You mentioned that religion is not taught in these schools, right? But are they excluding God? Are they excluding God? Because I don't understand how you can become so, what do you call it, secular in nature. Be humanistic, but secular at the same time. If they bring in the idea, in fact, if they invite, people talk about the beauty of Christianity, the beauty of Islam, the story of Moses. These are all great people. Why not include them instead of excluding them? That's the point.
Well, why not include the various religious
Well,
religions, religion leaders, and exclude God? I don't know how I could really answer your question, except this is the thought that ran through my mind as you framed it. And that was, you don't have to mention God to be presenting God's teachings. And I think you would reach people who are receptive in their mindset as religious people by mentioning him, but might turn off those who are more secular in their thinking. The schools, their mission is to teach those values that are the underpinnings of Islam without having to specifically mention any of the tenets of a religion or belief. And I think that could be just as effective as the other way, and perhaps even more so. I think no matter, every time you and I speak, we are always being selective. We choose our words, we choose what to say. Every time I give a talk, every now as I pick out my words and so forth, I have to leave things out that I want in my mind, but I cannot say. And I think, I don't think it's a weakness to have them out. I think it might even be a strength.
I just wanted to mention that our organization is part of a global conference on Fratelli Tutti, which is building human solidarity. Now, this is Pope Francis and the Grand Imam who are promoting this idea. So it isn't just Mr. Gulen who's trying to cut across the divides in our world. And how do we promote human solidarity? Well, education is one way to do that. Just like our global conference is another example.
Right.
So we have all these divides in the world, and I think people have different ways of trying to bridge the divides, and perhaps this is another way of.
I saw a hand or two.
Sure.
What,
Somebody else?
Oh, I was only going to say that, what this gentleman was saying, that maybe religion, you don't have to be religious if you're spiritual. You don't have to use the word God, or you don't have to have a certain religion, but if you have your spirit,
The heart.
your heart, yeah.
Just a comment. About 10 years ago, Jerry and I were in Egypt with 45 students and faculty. And we have visited many churches, visited the mosques as a university. In old Cairo, we saw a synagogue, the Church of Mary, and the Mosque of Amr al-As in the same location
Yes.
for hundreds of years. Nothing new. We live together in harmony. Christians, Jews, and Muslims, with no issue. So instead of excluding it, we're kind of celebrating each other's religion. In a way. That's my point.
Yes, and it's an excellent point, and something we hope we can see again more widespread throughout the world.
In the UAE, in the United Arab Emirates, they're building an interfaith center. And they'll have a church, a mosque, and a temple.
Yeah.
The three religions, three monotheism. So it's going to be, and it's funded by the United Arab Emirates government, but it came out of this Abrahamic Accords.
Mhm.
So they're trying to promote this idea of the three monotheistic religions, and they're going to have ongoing programs on interfaith of the three religions there, which again, it's another effort to bridge these divides in the world. Anybody else want to chime in here?
You got more comment?
I think we got one over here.
Okay.
The goose jump.
However, we
Yes,
haven't heard one.
Thank you, Professor. It's a very job, and thank you for the discussion. You mentioned somewhere in your discussion that there was no secret agenda. Right?
there was no,
There was no secret agenda.
Oh.
I mean, for someone like me, or for example, my roommate who both of us consider to be member of the movement, it is easy to say that, hey, you don't have to secret agenda. I don't know if you consider you are part of the movement, but as I'm just going to assume that you are not part of the movement, is there any way scientifically for you to measure that there's no secret agenda? And if there's not, what is the agenda?
If there is no secret agenda, what is the agenda? Um, Well, if it's a secret agenda, it wouldn't be secret if we all know it. I guess we start there. All I can say is, like-minded people get together, you and your 4 roommates, and may have certain ideas and goals and share them in that way. And just as good friends and people who are married together share certain kinds of information and knowledge, and it is something that they are part of. It is in a sense secret to the outsiders because it is an insider shared thing. We did try to penetrate that wall. We did try just to see by various kinds of questions. Obviously, the question was never, is there an agenda? Was there a political? It wasn't even something like, do you talk politics? It wasn't blunt, where kind of the antenna might go up and you see it. So what we did was in very indirect kinds of questioning, roundabout and so forth, see if we could find if students were being motivated to think a certain way, to challenge a certain existence that existed, whatever. The only thing we ever found that dealt with political agenda, if you will, and it wasn't even an agenda, was in Albania, which is notorious for its corruption, more than most countries. It's even the CIA World Factbook. I don't know if you know about that or not, but it's a very public profile of all countries. It's a very wonderful publication. Even there, they have the audacity to put it in print. And students would talk about, they hope someday that there will be less corruption in our country. And in Bosnia, people talked about the division. Bosnia has a very strange government. It rotates with 3 different ethnic groups. The president rotates it after, I forget the term now. I think it was 9 months or a year. I don't remember the exact term anymore, but it rotates. And they would talk about that. But that came out of the macro environment, if you will, not the micro environment of the school. The way about a religious agenda came about by asking questions about pressures from the non-believer of whatever faith, depending on which majority was there, and also other questions like that. And nothing ever came forward. Nothing bubbled to the surface that tempted us to proceed further. So based on our input, we concluded there was no secret agenda to be there, even though the attacks were made as such.
I think we should ask this question to intelligence services.
Yes.
What did you say?
You want to repeat that louder, please? Yes.
We should question the intelligence services.
Question the services that put forth such a thing.
Anybody else?
Yes, sir.
Thank you for your speech. Firstly, I would like to wonder, I wonder that the teachers, those dedicated teachers method, which makes these students have more self-confidence. Do you know which methods they use?
I'm being asked if I know which methods teachers use to help the students instill more self-confidence. No, I didn't probe for that, so I don't know the answer, I'm afraid. And I got that more from the students who would not have been aware of how it happened for the most part. Although I can tell you that time and time again, the students would say, he or she is more than my teacher. He's family. She's like a big sister. He's like a big brother to me. And I suspect that kind of relationship, along with the informal tea times and that sort of thing where things are talked about, might have been the ways. But other than that, I'm afraid I can't give the answer. But you now have piqued my curiosity as how did they do it? And that sounds like a follow-up study to me.
Yeah, basically you are saying that it's beyond the relation between the teacher and student, right?
I'm saying it's the relationship is a big part of it. A big part of it that helps for this self-esteem to be built up. think we used time.
I think we've kind of come to the time that we decided we would end the meeting. Attila?
If you can present this to our guests on behalf of our community here, that'd be great. So here it is, a small gift.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
All the ways.
I've always wanted a bag. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Art
Thank
block
you.
design canvases. Thank you very much.